Welcome back, Left Reckoners. We're very honored and excited today to be joined by Dharna Noor, who is a writer with the Boston Globe. Thank you so much, Dharna, for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Obviously, huge fan of the show, longtime listener.
Thank you.
If people missed Darna's first appearance, you should definitely go and check it out. We talked about all of the messed up things that are happening down in Louisiana. It's been too long, so we're really happy to have Dharna on. But we wanted to bring you on to talk about something a little technical because I think there's still a lot of fuzziness about it. And I'll do a quick plug. I did just put out a piece today in Green New Deal media called Joe Biden's Climate Bill is a Far Cry from the Green New Deal. Y'all can check that out. But I want to bring Dharna on because she follows these things much more closely than I do to sort of give us a sense about what the IRA is. The IRA it's a huge ass bill. It takes a lot of time to sort of come through. If you were to give people, just a brief summary of what they should think about when they hear the Inflation Reduction Act in relation to dealing with climate change, how would you sort of frame it?
I feel like I say this about so many different sort of like new provisions in the US about climate stuff, but I think the two biggest things about this are that it is the biggest investment that the US has ever made in climate policy by pretty far. It's a landmark investment, it's historic. And also, it is nowhere near what the science says is enough. Like, it is absolutely true that it is unprecedented. And it is also absolutely true that it gets nowhere near the levels of change that we need. So, pretty huge numbers, like almost $370 billion for climate and clean energy sort of policies, but also some pretty huge asterisks in there that, like, many people in the climate movement have called out.
Yeah, I think Kate Aronoff had a really good piece in the New Statesman trying to sort of break down the theory of change in the IRA. And I think a couple of things that are really notable is its reliance on tax credits as basically trying to spur the market to do something versus a system of like direct investment.
Yes.
Before we get to like the individual stuff, could you sort of set people up so they understand, what these kind of credits are, particularly for solar, but also for other forms of energy too?
Yeah, totally. So there's like tax incentives and rebates and things like this in the bill for individuals and then also for companies. So if you're a company and you put solar panels on your firm's buildings, or you power parts of your sort of supply chain with solar or things like this, you can get some money back. And then also if you're a homeowner or a renter, I guess sort of, although pretty clearly geared towards homeowners in many cases.
I don't think my landlord would let me put solar on my building. Just maybe being in Texas, but anyway.
Because landlords are, obviously so easy to deal with always. But yeah, so there's like incentives for people individually to do things like, buy new induction stoves or get solar panels on their homes and things like this. So there's like company level incentives, and then there's also individual level incentives. And that's, and that is sort of the theory of change of the bill, as you said, and that as Kate said, that's sort of the foundation of the like renewable energy policies.
Politically, it feels like where we're at. It reminds me of like a parent giving a present to a baby and trying to sell that baby on being very excited about that present. And it's like, yeah, this is a cool rattle, but it's like fundamentally we need something more than this. And like the theory of change, like you mentioned, I remember when Obamacare passed, there was this whole like sort of line for the progressives, which was, this is just a stepping stone on the way to what we all want, which is universal health care.
Totally. Yeah.
And that's a fun thing to like tell those voters like me that, and to keep us energized. But the leadership is not necessarily on board with that at all, as we found out. And I feel like that's the kind of we're speaking something to people who actually, like you say, acknowledge the reality of where scientists say we need to get to with climate, and also the like donor class, which is like that when they hear Biden say this is the biggest thing we've ever done, it's like, okay, we've done our bit, then we can like go back to drinking wine.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, so you mentioned the piece that Kate Aronoff wrote for the New Statesman. She wrote another piece, I think, in the New Republic that sort of zeroed in on this dynamic particularly, where like it's pretty difficult to criticize something that you A might be benefiting from, but B, even if you're like a nonprofit or like an advocacy group or something, if you've been campaigning on this message of like we are helping to get the biggest piece of climate legislation in the United States ever passed, and then it turns out to be pretty disappointing, you're probably not going to say that. You're probably going to stick to this message that it's historic and it's huge and everything, which, like, those things are true. But I think there's also plenty to be critical of in the bill. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always worth noting that, like, when we're talking about the size of investment, it's not even as big as Biden's original plans, and obviously a far cry away from Bernie Sanders and AOC's Green New Deal.
totally.
But I think it'd be helpful maybe to start to zero in, I think, on some of the more controversial parts of it, because, like, obviously we need tremendous investment. If like perfect world, we're going to need tremendous investment in our energy infrastructure, and frankly we need that, like climate change or not. It's terrible
Absolutely.
how failing our energy infrastructure is in this country. So, like, you could be a little cynical here and say, like, well, this is wonderful because it's sort of patching up some of those problems. But when you look at the kind of text of the IRA, it really does give a pretty significant advantage to the oil and gas industry, most notably when they're trying to open up federal lands to any kind of solar or wind projects. Correct me if I'm wrong, but oil companies are sort of getting first bid on those lands before the solar and wind are able to get in the first place.
Yeah, and in fact, the bill actually like requires that more public lands be offered for oil and gas leasing before those are used for before like any renewable energy projects. So wind and solar can be built on public lands. So it's not even like you get first dibs. It's that
Mhm.
the specific like the parcels of land have to be, you have to offer them up to the oil and gas industry specifically, and you have to get these sort of projects underway, it sounds like, before renewables can happen. And it's like not exactly clear what exactly that will look
Mm.
like. It's obviously been the subject of like tons and tons of criticism, rightly, from people who note that we cannot actually afford to build any more fossil fuel infrastructure if we're going to meet climate goals like that. Even top climate scientists are saying that we have to adhere to have a survivable future. But definitely pretty concerning, especially because this was marked as like the biggest climate investment that we've seen in U.S. history.
And I mean, not like not to try to put myself in Manchin's shoes too much, but like as policy, I think there's a problem with it because, like, I think a lot of folks, like, don't get me wrong, oil and gas wants to expand the places that they're able to drill, but I think people really should look at what happened during one, like COVID, and two, this most recent spike in gas prices. The fossil fuel industry has been really hesitant to even invest in their own infrastructure, right? Even in places that they already own oil. So, like, if the idea is like we're going to open up more land for drilling so that the price of gasoline goes down, you actually need to. It's not really that there's like a lack of places that the fossil fuel industry can expand production right now in the United States. It's actually the fossil fuel industry itself saying it doesn't seem as profitable as we would like it to be, or it's more profitable for us to keep kind of artificial scarcity around than anything like that. Again, not saying that they're not going to try to expand and that it's not a threat or anything like that, but if you're just trying to sit here and say, I'm playing this like a video game trying to boost energy production for my country, the fossil fuel companies themselves are like much more of a problem than the lack of available oil futures for them.
Yeah, 100%. And it's not as though there's a couple different places that are sort of targeted in the IRA for new drilling. One of them that's really huge is the Gulf of Mexico. It's not actually clear that this is a good idea economically for the oil and gas industry. They're expanding in tons of other places too.
Mhm.
But there are some other things in the bill that are pretty good for them. Whether or not you think that we need this kind of technology to like actually achieve climate goals, the fossil fuel industry has been pretty stoked, for instance, about carbon capture and storage incentives and things like this.
Mhm.
Those are hugely expanded in the bill. So there's some other sort of big gifts to the fossil fuel industry in the IRA also.
But I mean, before we start getting into the permitting stuff, because that's an interesting fight that we're seeing now. Um, I do want to be, positive and note that, like, there are some positive things, where public power companies can now
Absolutely.
access the government money, which has been a ridiculous, I don't know, hangover
Totally.
from a previous era where they've been sort of pushed out. So that's a very positive thing.
Yeah, it's really, really huge, and I think pretty little understood provision in this bill that essentially means that public power companies like public utilities and things like this can actually take advantage of the kinds of incentives that make it like financially feasible for them to bring renewable power online. So, hopefully we'll start seeing changes then in like the Tennessee Valley Authority and things like this that I know that, we've talked about here before.
Yeah, and like, just to like highlight that for folks, I mean, it created this very peculiar tension, particularly with the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, for people who don't know what that is, where there was, where basically solar wind projects were like were like sort of a net negative for these public power companies because they couldn't participate in the same way that private companies could, which again is like a very bad way to run environmental policy, because if you have a system like that provides a lot of energy to people, no reason for not to be able to take part in government initiatives to increase renewable energy.
Totally. And it's like a federal agency technically. You're creating an incentive system that means that the thing that you purportedly are in control of can't take advantage of the incentives that you are putting forth. So yeah, let's hope that sticks around. That's a pretty huge deal.
Well, before we get to the permitting fight, you mentioned it a little bit before, but for like individuals, you were mentioning that there's the retrofitting of like home appliances, but also EV credits. And someone with my politics, I get a little nervous sometimes with the tax system and what that actually means for more working people versus people in a higher income bracket. I mean, could you talk about the accessibility of these kind of credits to maybe somebody who's not in the 100,000 a year set, somebody more in the 50, 60 set?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a bunch of different on the like sort of home improvement front, like, retrofitting your home, whether that means getting new appliances or, having like more energy efficient windows, whatever it is. There's a bunch of different programs in the IRA. I think there's three different ones, and there's ones that are sort of specifically targeted towards low income folks that are rebates, meaning you don't have to owe a certain amount in taxes to get money back. Sorry, this is so deeply into the
No,
weeds.
this is important.
And then there's other ones that are sort of targeted by people who have a higher like tax burden, so people who make more money. I mean, I think the question there are questions about whether or not these kinds of incentive programs are even the best way to approach energy policy. Even if you put those aside, I think that a lot of the question will be in the implementation process of these. Like, it's not very useful to have a rebate program if nobody hears about your rebate program.
Mhm.
If when you go to buy a stove, it's not just like the first thing that people hear that you can get a stove that doesn't like create levels of pollution in your house that would be illegal outdoors. And now it might be cheaper to do that than it was before. So, the implementation will be really important. Also, there are some pretty huge questions about how markets will respond to these incentives, which is, again, like part of the question about these incentive structures in the first place. Markets are sticky, and private companies, obviously, their primary incentive is to make profits. So there are lots of questions about how they'll like adapt to these. You mentioned the EV credits. One huge sort of question there is that the Inflation Reduction Act creates new sort of qualifications. So in order for an EV to apply for these tax credits or to qualify for these tax credits, they'll now have to have a certain percent of the materials come from the US. They'll have to be manufactured in the US. Some of these like new sort of qualifications have already been phased in. So, there's this sort of foreign policy question of what that means for like future US relations with China. But even if you think that this is a good thing for like boosting US markets and US, manufacturing jobs and things like this, there are some pretty big questions about how fast exactly manufacturers are going to be able to keep up with these new things. So, all of it is just basically, again, markets are super complicated and these are all market-based solutions. And so that means that there will be lots and lots of big sort of question marks moving forward.
Is the made in America aspect of the IRA, is that going to be influencing kind of both like supply side and like residential solar and wind projects as well, or is that just limited to EVs?
As far as I know, actually, that's a good question. But as far as I know, it's just the EV stuff. But that, I mean, that could influence a number of different sectors. Like it could mean that in the future, there's more mining in the U.S. for like the kind of critical minerals and things that we need for EV batteries. It could mean that there's more of a need for manufacturing facilities and stuff like that in the U.S. The supply chain for this stuff is like basically non-existent in the United States right now. So like the future is just very, very unclear on this stuff.
Well, I was hoping to get to something else, which, you know, is definitely on the top of most people's minds. It's a very sexy topic. Permitting reform in the U.S.
Yeah, so we're not in the weeds enough already.
But this is important. Like there's a lot on it going on right now because so interrupt me if I'm presenting this wrong, but effectively in the IRA, there's a call in it that to make these things happen, to make this system work, we need to have permitting reform in the United States. And what they mean by that is, you know, the U.S. we have like we have a very complicated, long system for most kind of projects that are doing any kind of, you know, large scale pipeline, or even if you're trying to build transmission systems for solar and wind, which by the way, y'all, like that's one of the issues with solar and wind is that, you know, we can talk about how great it is that there's a lot of land in West Texas, but when you think about where the metropolitan areas are, it's far away. So you have to have a system that's able to transfer that electricity to the places where it's going to be used. So there has to be a way, if you want to build out these systems on a faster timeline, to make it a bit quicker. But the way that the Manchin has basically been proposing it would be a kind of, you know, all of the above policy where it's like you're not picking one industry over the other. You're basically trying to fast track oil pipelines as much as you're trying to fast track, you know, electric transmission lines.
Yeah, totally. And this comes actually from like a sort of handshake agreement that Chuck Schumer and Manchin made. The idea was sort of, you know, Manchin was obviously like on the fence about the Inflation Reduction Act. And so Schumer was sort of like, you know, well, if you vote in favor of this thing that we want, then we'll give you the thing that you want, which is permitting reform. He says permitting reform, pretty clearly a huge part of that is he wants the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is a gas pipeline that's going to be sited through his home state of West Virginia. So, you know, in addition to sort of ensuring that that pipeline would get built, which is a pretty huge deal, you know, hugely contested pipeline for years and years, that would put tons of folks at risk who are like already breathing polluted air and, you know, drinking polluted water and things like this. Yeah, it treats all energy as sort of, you know, we need more solar, we need more wind, we also need more gas, which, you know, we don't. But yeah, so that's the sort of premise of the permitting bill.
And I don't mean to put you on this box. I know these are pretty complicated, but I mean, effectively, what we're talking about here, would it be that the federal government would be sort of like overriding other systems of, you know, community say, or would it be? I mean, how exactly are we talking? I mean, because I get the idea of like fast tracking it, but like, what's the function? Like, how are we actually fast tracking these systems?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's a bunch of different ways that it works. So, you know, some of these provisions basically say that there's only a certain short window where people can file like civil complaints or lawsuits against new infrastructure, which itself is pretty scary. You know, a huge way that people can even have say in the infrastructure that gets built in their communities is by filing lawsuits. And so limiting that could be pretty spooky. Yeah, then there's some other sort of provisions where it says that the Biden administration needs to identify some sort of critical projects and fast track those, meaning that it needs to give them permits really quickly. It means that environmental reviews have to take place over a much shorter period of time. Environmental reviews are, you know, often really complicated and can take a really long time for a reason. Not to say that they're never kind of drawn out, but I think it's pretty important to like see how infrastructure will affect the people who it's built near. So, you know, opens the door for fast tracking in a bunch of different ways.
Especially in this country.
100%.
So, sorry, Matt, were you about to say something?
No, I was just laughing.
So, you know, basically for everyone who hasn't been following, like the politics of this now is that we need to have a new spending bill passed, and they're basically trying to attach it to the spending bill, and it's been quite controversial. There's been a bit of a fight about it. Before we start to speculate as to whether or not it's going to happen or not, let's hear from Manchin himself to see how he's framing this issue. This is from just a couple of days ago. Manchin giving a press conference.
I guess the old saying that politics makes strange bedfellows.
I got to be honest with you. I've been around for a long time in state politics and federal politics. I've never seen stranger bedfellows than Bernie Sanders and the extreme liberal left siding up with the Republican leadership in the caucus. I've never seen this happen. So it's come to me. What I'm hearing is it's like a revenge politics, and basically revenge towards one person, me. And I'm thinking, this is not about me. This is about something that Bernie has never supported anything about permitting reforms. And you're facing a country today, we've passed this out to you, I think, permitting timelines. If you look at what we do in the United States, 5 to 10 years, that's a minimum. If you look at basically states that have, countries that have vigorous environmental oversights, 1 to 3 years, 1 to 3 years. And then if you look at what's happening now because of the energy crisis we have in the Ukraine war, you have EU is considering emergency bypassing of all environmental reviews, and we don't think we're in a crisis, and we're not going to do anything about it, and we can. And then you look here at the energy prices. Look what the people in America are facing right now. 200% increase of natural gas. Natural gas increases to regular gasoline's up 67%. Residential electricity, 15%. And then look at what's happening as far as overseas, 1,100% increase. Did you all get one of these? If you
The elder statesman. But yeah, I mean, like, again, like, it's interesting, just really talking politics. Manchin really, I think, has set himself as like I don't know. It's funny because one day he's reluctant about the IRA and all these things, and the other day, and then the next day he's trying to present as like, look what I've done, look what I'm pushing. Why aren't people supporting this bill? Bernie Sanders is doing revenge policy. Just to set us all up on the same page, we have this response from Bernie Sanders on the Bird app. I can't do a good Bernie, but I'll read it. No, defeating the big oil side deal is not about revenge. It's about whether or not we will stand with 650 environmental and civil rights organizations who understand that the future of the planet is with renewable energy and energy efficiency, not approving the Mountain Valley Pipeline. The Mountain Valley Pipeline would generate emissions equivalent to 37 coal plants or putting 27 million more cars on the road. It's hard for me to understand why anyone concerned about climate change would consider voting to approve such a dirty and dangerous frack gas pipeline. The big oil side requires the president to prioritize 25 energy projects for expedited environmental reviews. Of those, 19 could be dirty fossil fuels or mining projects, and 0 are required to be renewable energy projects that would reduce emissions. This is unacceptable. So this is the fight that we're seeing in Congress. And I mean, unless you have anything that you might want to say about the way Bernie or Manchin are framing that, I mean, what are the politics looking like this? I mean, is Bernie just doing a classic Bernie, standing and making a point before it gets overwhelmingly passed, or does it look like there might be a fracture on this?
Oh, I mean, it seems that there could definitely be a fracture on this, especially because, I mean, I don't know if it's revenge, but it certainly seems that there was a sort of competing permitting bill that some sort of Republicans rallied around, a bunch of them. And, there's been quite a bit of sort of criticism of Manchin from the Republican side for supporting the Inflation Reduction Act in the first place. It's not clear at all whether or not there's going to be enough votes to get this thing through. If there is, it's pretty clear that he's going to have to get some Republicans on his side. He said so himself. So not clear what this is going to look like, which, as you sort of said before, that could mean that we also have a little government shutdown.
Not an infrequent thing in US
Yeah,
politics.
exactly. I know it sounds so dramatic, and then you're like, oh yeah, like all the other ones.
And it's also like his whole shit is supposed to be his ability to work with Republicans. So like you should be able to like get some to sign on with you. And that's if one guy, Bernie Sanders, like I wish Bernie was able to lock stuff down like this, be in a little bit better position. But I mean, I think it says more about Republicans actually.
Totally. Yeah, 100%.